So in today's web dev tip, we're going to do another Codewars coding challenge, and I quite like this challenge because it mimics something that you would actually do in a real world application or project. And what you're asked to do is basically write a function that checks someone's results for a particular multiple choice questionnaire. So this cat is called check the exam, and we've got this function that we need to write that takes two arrays. And the first array, array 1, is actually the correct answers to an exam or a multiple choice questionnaire. And the second array contains the student's answers. So what we need to do is kind of mark the student's answers against the correct answers and return a score. So they've made it quite easy for this particular challenge because the arrays are actually the same length and they're not empty. And if the student hasn't given an answer, we've just got a blank string. So the rules basically are, if we've got a correct answer, we need to add 4 to the result, to the score. If they get something wrong, we need to take 1 away. And if the student doesn't answer, if we get a blank string in our item in the array, then we just don't return any score for that one. So we need to sum all those values up and then return it from the exam. So because we're going to be looping through the arrays and comparing each value in each position, then it's probably a good idea to use a for loop here so we can grab the index value generated by that for loop and then reference each array with that value. So it would look something a bit like this. So we'll say for let I is equal to 0 because the index position 1 for the arrays will be at 0 and I is less than, and we can just take array 1.length because we know that it will be the same for array 2. We don't need to work out which array is longer in this instance, and let's just increment I at each iteration. So we've got this value I that we can then use for array 1 to check the value inside there and also compare that to the value that's inside of array 2 at position I. So before we start comparing those values, let's first set up a running total. So inside of our function, let's set a total score value equal to 0 to start off with. So what we can do to make things a bit more meaningful is rename these arguments that have been passed in, the arrays, because it doesn't really make much sense at the moment. So instead of array 1, let's say correct answers maybe. And then for array 2, we'll say student answers there, and let's just make sure we update this here, and we'll just use correct answers length here. So what we're going to do then is kind of compare the student answers against the correct answer. So let's just remove that now and say if the student answer at position I is equal to the correct answer, correct answers at position I, then what do we need to do? Well, this rule tells us to add 4 to the total, so total plus is equal to 4. And we also need to check for incorrect answers as well. So if the student answer at position I does not equal the correct answers at position I, then total minus equals 1. And there's a little bit of a problem with that, which you'll see in a second, but that should get us started for checking the output. So you can see we've addressed the first 2 rules that we've got in the instructions. So let's hit the test button and see what happens. As I say, we'll probably get some tests failing here. Okay, here we go. So we've got a syntax error there. I've said student answers there. So yes, the argument was plural, so let's just update that. That wasn't one of the tests failing, it was just my bad typing there. Okay, so here we go, we've got some errors in our tests. And actually that's because I haven't actually returned anything from the function yet, so I forgot to do that. So obviously we need to return the total once for loop's completed from the function, because otherwise the function will return nothing and all of the tests will fail. So let's try that one more time and hopefully we'll get some problems here. Okay, so we've got one of the tests failing here. It doesn't actually tell us which test it was that failed. So it should be this one here, I think on line 8. So the student here has given us A, and that matches the first 2 answers here. So that should give us 8. And then B should subtract 1 because the answer was C here and they put B. But the interesting one with this is that there's a blank string which does not equal B. So our code at the moment has subtracted another 1. So basically the test is given, or the function is given back 6, whereas expecting 7. And that's because we haven't addressed that third rule of if the student has not entered an answer, an empty string, for example, in the array, then we just do nothing. We don't add anything onto the total. So there's a couple of ways we could approach that, but probably the simplest with the code that we've got at the moment is to put another condition within this if statement that's saying if the student answer does not equal the correct answer and the student answer is not actually an empty string. So we should say student answers I does not equal, and we'll be very explicit here, we'll just use an empty string. So if we run the test again, that should take into consideration that particular test case there with the empty string. You can see we're getting a different error in the output here at the moment, and I think that's because this last test here, basically they didn't answer anything right and they provided an empty string here. And I'm guessing you can't get a score of -1. I don't know if it says that in the... Okay, yeah, so if the score is less than 0, then we need to return 0. So that's another rule that we need to add in here. So the total we've got at the moment might be a negative value. So we can put a condition here in the return statement that if total is less than 0, we'll use a ternary operator here, then we'll return 0. But if it's not, if it's greater than 0, then we'll return the total. And that should address that last case there to return non-negative values. So let's test that again. And this time we've got all of our tests passing. So can there be any improvements made to this? Well, yeah, probably. So we could do some better checking on whether the student has provided us with our answer or not. But realistically, the data that's coming in, we know that it's going to be an empty string. So we could potentially just coerce this into a Boolean value, and this would make this a bit neater. But in essence, I think really we need to use a for loop here for this, so we can get the index value of I, so we can compare each item in the array in turn. And I think it leads to some fairly readable code, so you can understand what's going on, especially once we've renamed the arguments as well, because then you can understand what you're actually doing, what you're comparing with the if statements. Okay, so that's pretty much it for today's coding challenge. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.